Good morning and welcome to the Grim. I'm your host, Kristen. On today's episode, we'll be opening the gate and entering Highgate Cemetery, located in London, England. So grab your favorite mug, cozy up, and let's take a dig into history. It's one of the Magnificent Seven and notorious for hauntings, ghosts, rock and roll parties, vampires, and the burial ground of London's elite Victorian members of society. Highgate is one of the top 10 cemeteries in the world, and a must-see in my opinion. It's also currently my favorite cemetery at the moment that, if asked, I wouldn't hesitate to reply with naming. Highgate comes with a long history filled with Gothic Victorian architecture and, surprisingly, a nature reserve. The cemetery is open 10 to 5 daily, except for Christmas Day and Boxing Day, and has an entry fee of £10 per adult and children under 18 £6, but under 7 are free. The west side, or the older side, can be only entered with a tour, and if you're looking to only enter the east side, a discounted ticket option is available. I highly recommend taking the tour, though, as you have access to both sides of the cemetery for the day, and the tour guides are some of the most knowledgeable I've ever had on any tour or experience. It's also good to know that most of the Gothic architecture visitors seek is only available on the tour. Plus, having a tour guide with a dry wit of the British makes for an unforgettable experience in a graveyard. The cemetery originally was run by the private London Cemetery Company, which is no longer in business but now oversaw by the charity Friends of Highgate. As with most cemeteries these days, it runs off donations and the profit of its ticket sales, which isn't much but a worthy cause of preserving its vital part of British history. Established in 1839, the cemetery was part of a larger plan to help bury London's ever-growing population. In the 19th century, London's population doubled in size from around 1 million to 2 million, causing more than just overcrowding housing. The normally small parish graveyards that provided burials saw an impossible strain on space, but even larger problems occurred. Decaying bodies were contaminating water supplies, causing epidemics, rats defiling loved ones, grave robbers, and burials over already filled plots. The situation of how London was handling its death needed an overhaul from its bygone ways. Parliament started passing acts encouraging the development of private cemeteries to unburden parishes quickly to resolve the issues. After an inspirational visit to Paris's Père Lachaise Cemetery, London's architects developed a plan to form 7 large cemeteries near London's outer city. Thus, the Magnificent Seven were constructed and built. Highgate was the third of the 7 planned for the city in the northwestern region of London, near the northern borough of Camden. All but one of the Magnificent Seven are still active cemeteries to this day and can be visited or toured. Each are a bucket list item of mine to visit, and eventually, hopefully, one day I will, but currently I have 2 of the 7 crossed off, and if you already do, I admit I'm definitely jealous. The men behind Highgate Cemetery were Stephen Geary, James Bunstone Bunning, both who are buried within the grounds, and David Ramsay, a self-proclaimed garden architect. Geary became famously known for Highgate's Egyptian Avenue and the Terrace Catacombs, rightfully so, and Bunning for the colonnade, the space between the courtyard and the chapels, and the entry gate into the west side. The cemetery houses around 170,000 souls on 15 acres of consecrated and 2 acres of unconsecrated land, split on either side of Swan Lane in London's borough of Camden. The original plot of land designed for the grounds was expanded after just 15 years due to its popularity in London society. During the establishment of the Magnificent Seven, Victorians' obsession and favorable attitude toward death made cemeteries a fashionable and popular destination. Geary created the Circle of Lebanon, the Egyptian Avenue, and the Terrace Catacombs surrounded by lush gardens envisioned by Ramsay. The visitors could take high tea on the roof of the catacombs while visiting family plots in high fashion. Showing off not only meant a family plot was reserved in one of the 7, but crypts, tombs, and monuments to loved ones lost were handcrafted in Victorian Gothic splendor, which to this day is breathtaking to visitors. The private company during its heyday printed pamphlets encouraging visitors to tour the grounds and advertised heavily to encourage London's elite to claim Highgate as their final resting place. It's important to note that not all the cemeteries were owned by the same companies, so competition was fierce for where society made its top cemetery. Of those families in London's elite society, most notably was the Beers, and within Highgate, the mausoleum of Julius Beers, originally built for his daughter Ada, who tragically passed away at the age of 8 from scarlet fever in 1875. Julius was stricken by grief and built the finest monument in the cemetery, sparing no expense, and it still is to this day unsurpassed in splendor and cost. Mausoleum is grand in size with larger-than-life bronze doors, a mosaic ceiling by Salviti from Venice, and a lifelike statue of Ada being lifted to heaven. The statue of Ada he commissioned was completed the same year as his passing, at just 43 years old in 1880, 5 years after Ada's death. The rest of the Beers family is also within. The Beers Mausoleum is an example of the opulent expression Victorians took of grief and death within Highgate Cemetery. These cemeteries gave the upper class the ability also to protect their loved ones. In the 19th century, grave robbery became a huge problem in the city of London, selling anything of value, including bodies, which was a common and heartbreaking experience for families. Reports of the poor using bones as firewood occurred, and even grinding up the bones for medicinal purposes actually happened. High brick walls and only a few gates saw robberies decrease significantly, becoming harder and harder. The catacombs were the safest part of Highgate Cemetery, as they were locked and only unlocked by family members or being escorted by a guide within. The grounds of Highgate Cemetery are full of wildflowers, shrubs, and wildlife, making the Victorian Gothic splendor of the graves feel even more ostentatious at times. The irony of this is that in the 1970s, the cemetery was falling into disarray. Save from a charity formed called the Friends of Highgate, memberships are available, but the only other source of revenue apart from the entry tickets into the grounds is donations. Volunteers help run the cemetery from caring to the grounds to the tours. Passionate and fully aware of the historical significance of preservation, their efforts are astonishing and can be seen when visiting. The main gates on Swans Road into Highgate feel more like going into a royal palace than a cemetery. High walls with iron gates and 2 chapels meet you in fine splendor. One chapel is for members of the Church of England and the other for dissenters. A large courtyard sends you across the colonnade. Every part of the design from entry to exit was meticulously designed for the eye to visually grasp guests into believing this was the entry into the afterlife. The entry into the west side sees visitors through a gate up the stairway into the cemetery, a nod of a way of entering heaven or the afterlife. Graves are set along uneven natural paths that almost make visitors feel like they're on a beginner's hike, so beware if you're planning to visit. Natural vines covering the Egyptian avenue give it a grand ethereal feel to visitors, while momentarily causing them to forget their grief. The obsession or interest in Egyptology during Victorian times can be seen here. The Egyptian avenue was once enclosed with a roof, but it was sadly lost over the years. You then head through the avenue with a set of 8 family vaults on either side, room for 12 coffins, each elaborately decorated with stonework to loved ones with symbolism. Most lie half full but house something even more rare, black orb spiders or cave spiders. Not native to England, it remains a mystery of how these spiders are in the vaults even today. It's believed they were brought back in a coffin by one of the buried residents from overseas. They, however, are not seen by many visitors, thankfully, as they don't like daylight. Leading guests next into the circle of Lebanon's double ring of mausoleums and tombs. Sadly, in 2019, the cedar of Lebanon tree, for which the double ring was named after, was cut down due to disease and decay, but has since been replaced. The site still gives visitors pause and reflection with the architecture and size of the tombs. Some might be familiar with the Circle of Lebanon from Harry Potter's Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. The scene in the film was featuring the circle. Meandering a little further, you find the cemetery's terraced catacombs and the mausoleum of Julius Beer. Situated at the highest peak of Highgate, Gary's vision of the terrace in the 19th century was one of beauty. Today, the views are obstructed by the growth of trees. Yet in its heyday, the views of central London were breathtaking for its visitors. By the design, the catacombs have no electricity, so they are illuminated by skylights, making the catacombs feel eerie and gives visitors chills even on the hottest of days. Three locked gates guard the catacombs, which house 29 coffins on the north side and 26 coffins on the south. Each coffin is sealed with a block of white marble, granite, a glass pane, or an iron grate depending on the family's preference. The 320-foot terrace was Highgate's crown jewel selling point. Advertising using the terrace was part of its allure and popularity. Families would promenade and take tea admiring the views of central London. In the 1960s, though, Highgate was dilapidated and lost to time. It was a vastly different place. The garden from its heyday was overgrown, taking over the grounds, but it wasn't abandoned by the public at all. In fact, breaking into the cemetery was a common occurrence nightly, with parties, vandalism, vampire hunts, and recreational drug use. Once a place of London's high society during the day, it became the scene of the party at night. Teens, intrigued by tales, looking for answers and thrills, would climb the walls to explore, and rock and roll legends are rumored to have partied within the catacombs. The damage of broken seals within and the coffins open are signs from these nights. The nightlife in the cemetery led to stories and accounts of ghosts, from spectral visions to disembodied voices, a gray figure walking through the graves, and more. How many of these stories were true or how the effects from partying conjured them into reality are speculatory. Stories sent to the local newspapers morphed into more than tall tales the public devoured. One tale of a vampire buried on the grounds before Highgate's conception became more popular than others. The man responsible for the newspaper stories was David Ferret, a local paranormal enthusiast who became enthralled with Highgate after two similar tales he came across from two separate people with experiences within the grounds. Both claims reported to see a tall, dark figure with glaring eyes floating toward them within the grounds. Ferret wondered if there could be more incidents, that's why he reported these events to the newspaper. Hoping to encourage others to come forward, Ferret got more than he bargained for with many other incidents reported within Highgate. He then started attempting to debunk these rumors for himself, staying overnight in the cemetery looking to disprove the claims, but only came to experience his own encounter. Ferret was quoted saying, "But around midnight, I caught sight of a figure, about 7 feet tall, that appeared to be floating just above the ground. I saw its face and 2 points of intense red light. The area turned icy cold as if I'd stepped into a refrigerator. The figure seemed to be draining me of energy, and I felt I was losing control of my own normal faculties. It felt like a vivid dream, like I wanted to wake up but couldn't." At this point, even after having his own personal encounter and confirming to himself the tales were true, Ferret didn't put a name on what he encountered. The newspapers reporting Ferret's story, however, reached another local paranormal enthusiast named Sean Manchester, who believed he could name this entity or creature, saying Ferret had experienced a vampire. Contacting the same local newspaper, Manchester decided to take his theories public. When he took his theory to a journalist and had an article published, "Does a Vampire Walk in Highgate?" This elaborate theory conjectured a vampire, who originally was an aristocrat practitioner of black magic from Romania, had moved to England in the 18th century in a coffin by way of his followers. His coffin interred on the grounds of Highgate prior to his establishment, thus why it was unknown, but a king vampire of the undead was buried in the cemetery. Blaming his rise on rituals by Satanists partying on the grounds, awakening his presence. Which, understandably, this article had locals enthralled and wondered what was within the grounds. Ferret did find within the grounds discarded remains of satanic rituals, stubs of black candles, and satanic markings on the floor of tombs. In one small chapel-like tomb, with a marble floor and stained glass windows, an inverted pentagram had been drawn on the floor, leading him also to believe an evil presence had been awakened in Highgate. The problem was that in the 1960s and 70s, occult or religious beliefs other than Christianity had a revival in religion. The grounds, being a secluded outdoor area, became a popular meeting place for occult groups, leading to misunderstanding and more speculation than anything. The media was enthralled and eventually reached nationwide news and were ravenous for more. On the evening of Friday the 13th in March of 1970, a program aired on national television featuring both Manchester and Farron, with others who also claimed to have encounters. During the live stream right outside the grounds of Highgate, more joined in, leading to a public mob of vampire hunters climbing the gates searching frantically among the Victorian tombs for the creature. The police eventually caught all the trespassers, but the damage to Highgate was done. Both Manchester and Ferret being arrested after breaking into catacombs and performing an exorcism with holy water, garlic, and sprinkling salt within. For the next few years, both men continued their hunts of the Highgate vampire and also had a very public feud. This led to Manchester eventually stabbing a corpse 4 years later to what he believed was the creature, and with his followers burning the body, purging Highgate in his eyes of the vampire. Ferret and Manchester infamously challenged each other to meet in a magician's duel on Parliament Hill on Friday the 13th of April in 1973, but it never happened. Eventually, Ferret was jailed in 1974 after being convicted of interfering with remains and vandalizing memorials in Highgate Cemetery. Filled with high society, ostentatious Victorian Gothic tombs and vaults, Highgate also saw its fair share of the poor interred on its grounds as well. Buried in mass graves on unconsecrated land is one terrible tale of London's past. Marked as a burial ground also for English dissenters or separatists of different faith that were located in this area is an unmarked grave filled with girls and women. Once inmates at the Highgate Penitentiary for Fallen Women, their stories remained a mystery in an unmarked mass grave until researchers in 2014 uncovered their past. Back in Victorian times, fallen women were prostitutes or any woman found having sexual relations outside their marriage. Many of the women were under the age of 20, with the age of consent back in the 19th century being just 12 years old. Almost all the girls had been cast out from their families, seeking safe havens. It was originally established by the Bishop of London in 1856. The aim of the penitentiary was the salvation of these women's souls through spiritual guidance and vocational training to punishment or reproach. Girls would stay for 2 years and in that time learn to cook, sew, read, and write along with mandatory religious participation. The mass grave contained most notably Emma Jones, who had died at the age of 12 and was buried with 10 other unnamed girls till 2014, when historians were finally able to uncover their identities. The grave reminds visitors of London's harsh past for the poor to make ends meet, but also the rigorous standards in society held against women. Other faiths outside the Church of England, looking to be buried within, were also allowed to be buried on the unconsecrated acreage. Families split in their views with faith would be across from each other on either consecrated or unconsecrated land. The unconsecrated lands marks Britain's past persecution of nonconformity and the hardships some endured even in death from poverty. It's definitely a less grand and darker side of history, but a reminder to visitors. Yet not all graves in the dissenters section are full of tragic stories. Scientist Michael Faraday and his wife Sarah's graves can be found nearby. Faraday invented an early form of what we now call the Bunsen burner. He worked extensively in the field of chemistry, discovering chemical substances such as benzene, which he called bicarbonate of hydrogen, and liquefying gases such as chlorine. But his greatest work was his work on electricity and magnetism. Faraday established the foundation of modern electromagnetic technology. Yet due to other scientists having similar findings at the exact same time, his efforts in science went unnoticed for some time and created strains with others in the science community. Eventually, Faraday, who continuously published his findings, was recognized and celebrated for his work. He worked extensively for the Royal Institution, was granted by the University of Oxford an honorary Doctor of Civil Law degree, and was offered knighthood in recognition for his services to science, but he turned it down on religious grounds. Faraday had the option to be buried within Westminster Abbey upon his death, but Prior had turned down the offer, selecting Highgate as his final resting place. Tourists, when visiting the Abbey, will find a memorial plaque dedicated to the brilliant scientist near Sir Isaac Newton's tomb. I, of course, didn't fully cite all of Faraday's accomplishments, but I encourage visitors with any interest in science to definitely do more reading on him, as I fully can't do him justice in the short amount of time within this episode. The east side of the cemetery is equally beautiful but filled with more modern graves. Filled with less than larger life Filled with less than larger than life Gothic Victorian fare, its beauty is still renowned and the gardens breathtaking. The most famous grave on the east side is Karl Marx, the father of communism. Originally buried in 1883 in a small grave next to his wife, he received a larger, more prominent grave in 1956 from the Marx Memorial Fund. In 1970, two bombings occurred at the grave, but no severe damage occurred. His followers find the tomb a place of veneration where others find it a place to commit vandalism. A love story that turns sour and grim also haunts these grounds. Famous pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood model Elizabeth Sadell is buried within. The beautiful model married one of the founders, Dante Gabriel Rosselletti, but their happiness was short-lived. Her continuing health problems from modeling and Rosselletti's infidelity caused immense strain on their marriage. Her husband of 2 years came home to find her dying from an accidental overdose of laudanum. Rossetti then wrote a series of love poems to her while mourning over her casket, which were buried with her. But the story doesn't stop there. 7 years later, when his reputation was failing, his agent suggested retrieving the poems to sell, and Rosselletti agreed. He then signed an exhumation order and, for privacy, had her exhumed in the middle of the night from the family tomb. Expecting to see a decaying cadaver, the diggers were speechless when they found Elizabeth perfectly preserved, appearing to be asleep. Rossetti didn't have the bravery to assist and was absent. The poems were removed, but never gave Rossetti the fortune he assumed they would. The exhumation haunted him for the rest of his life. The list of London's elite buried within the walls of Highgate is a long one. George Michael, Malcolm McLaren, sci-fi author Douglas Adams, and Russian intelligence agent Alexander Levenko are just the start of who's buried. George Michael is somewhere on the west side, but the tour guides will not divulge any information on where his grave is exactly. From a famous boxer, firefighters, women of the night, naval officers, or men who amassed fortunes in finance, the list within the 170,000 buried is impressive. However different their levels of society, they all found familiarity in death, being remembered by visitors on a tour or families looking to mourn past members. Some might not have the same ostentatious graves, yet lie 6 feet below in the same box. Whatever the reason you might find yourself at Highgate's gates, it's worth the price of admission for a stroll into history, the beautiful wildlife, gardens, and one-of-a-kind Victorian Gothic architecture. The grave grind for Highgate Cemetery was a flat white from Monmouth Coffee Company in Covent Garden, London. For now, we're closing the gate on Highgate Cemetery. We hope you enjoyed our dig into history. If you did, subscribe today and join us next time when we open the gate on the Grim.